Gary comes to Tyndale from Canadian Baptist Ministries. He was there for a number of years. Before that, he was pastoring at First Baptist in Edmonton and developed his urban missiological framework in that context, I would say. Is that right, Gary? His wife, Carla, heads up the Bachelor of Education program at Tyndale and has been a friend over the years, especially in the days when she was a part of the task force in education that Glenn Smith chaired. So she's also close to the EFC. It's a delight to introduce you, Gary, and I ask all of you to welcome him.
I've changed a lot of what I was going to do because I think I want to build on some of the things that Alan's been speaking about. And I do want to talk about Canadian context because I think I'll be honest with you, I think it's time. I as a Canadian for so many years, have been watching as we listen for our cues from people to the south or to the UK or other places. And we need to hear from those voices because they're very helpful. But over the last 15 years, I think one of the things that I've become more and more conscious of is that our conversation that we've been having in Canada that's been going on for a long time needs to be given voice so that we begin to take our context seriously. I've been reflecting about this, what we've been talking about today, for instance. And I can remember an EFC sponsored event called Vision 2000. Some of you may remember that. And there was an urban task force that was never ever in sync with the whole Vision 2000 piece. And it was because there was a few, like Glenn Smith, Rick Tobias, myself, Alan Roxborough, and a few others who were part of that. And what we were struggling with is, what does it mean to be the church in an urban context? And I think this would have been the early 90s. And I think for what we began to realize is that what we've been talking about today is what, let's just call it, what's good ministry? What would Jesus want us to do? But the thing that changes is context and how we take those things that we're being called to and begin to understand them in the context that we're in. And that's why I want to talk a little bit about the Canadian context, and I'll talk about it by telling a few stories. During that same conversation, I was directing an urban training program in the city of Toronto. I've lived in exile as a Western Canadian twice in Toronto, and that was the first time. And I lived in a neighborhood in the Bathurst, for you who know Toronto, in the Bathurst St. Clair area of Toronto. Someone knows that area? Good. And there was a neighborhood baseball team that was a part of this, and it was part of the oldest softball league in Toronto called the Wine and Vinyl League. And it had been going on forever, and the wonderful thing about this league was we got kind of first dibs on all the diamonds throughout the downtown inner core. And we got invited to join this team. Now, I need to say, it's partly because Carla can hit a ball miles. She can kind of, and we had to play a certain number of women on the team, and so she was kind of the ringer for the team. It was a wonderful experience because there were all these people that, it was like a cross-section of Toronto. There was a Marxist sociology professor from the University of Toronto who was part of it. There was a Jewish labor lawyer. There was people who worked at home. There was people who commuted. It was just this amazing kind of group of people. The Jewish labor lawyer, when he first found out that I was a Baptist minister, just didn't know what to do with this. You know, the terrible question you always get asked. For you who are Alliance or something really nice, you know, being Baptist, we're forever having to apologize for the people in the South. And so, I mean, it's a dreadful experience when you get asked, so what do you do? And I remember the day when we were first practicing as a team in this first year, and they said the dreaded question, what do you do? It's really nice now, Hubert, I can say I'm the president of a university college and seminary, and it sounds so much better than saying I'm a Baptist minister. But so I said I'm a Baptist minister, which then starts the conversation, right? Why they don't go to church, you know, what's a Baptist, all of those kinds of questions. But just to make the story faster, over 3 years, I experienced something that shaped the rest of my understanding of ministry since that moment. It was an interesting experience, first of all, as I said, because most of those people had no church experience whatsoever. Welcome to Canada. In Canada today, more and more people have less and less Christian memory. It's a context. Over and over, you run into people who don't know the geography. They don't know the language. They don't know what they're supposed to do choreographically. We think by putting on choruses and having a band that somehow that is the thing that will bridge the gap. But most of our next-door neighbors aren't that trivial. I live in a condo. I'm on the 28th floor. There are 8 condos around us. Not one of them goes to church on a Sunday morning. And they're not waiting for my little church to get a worship band. It wouldn't make a difference. More and more people have less and less Christian memory. As we began to develop, we learned that the first year was a little awkward. Oftentimes, I'd get all sorts of kind of caricatures of what they thought I was. For instance, one time I came up to bat, and the third base coach stepped out and he said, "Gary, God is watching." And I said, "Thanks, Chris. I thought I was like all the rest of you, alone." And then I stepped back in the batter's box, and Chris went. So there was this kind of parrying, you know? We're kind of getting to know each other. They're lowering their anxiety, and I'm breaking down the barriers. After 3 years, it was this ongoing relationship that during the winter, the parties would take place. We would be invited. There was this amazing kind of support that took place. One person was a CBC reporter. His marriage broke up. He lived across the street from us. Another one was a Sicilian. It's another story altogether. When we had decided we were going to move back to Edmonton, or move back west and move to Edmonton, and we announced it to the team, the biggest concern for them is that we'd be around for the playoffs so Carla could play. And they threw a barbecue. And this is what I remember. It was a wonderful evening. We were in the backyard of one of these people's houses. And Bob, the Marxist sociology professor, stops the conversation all of a sudden. And he says this: "Gary and Carla, we've been talking. This bothered me. I figured there was either a party that had gone on that we hadn't been invited to, or some kind of conversations had been going on behind the scenes." He said, "We've been talking, and we just have one question. One, and it's this. Now listen to the question. Do you fit? Do you fit?" I said, "Do I fit what? I know I'm getting bigger." I went through all of these kinds of things. He said, no. Do you fit? Listen, we've never had a Baptist minister, or for that matter, he said, someone who took Christian faith seriously within our kind of sphere. And we just want to know, you're not like what we thought you would be like. More and more people in Canada have less and less Christian memory. It was this wonderful 45 minutes after that of being able to talk about our faith, of who we were. You have to meet Carla, because those of you who know her will know that she has lived her faith out in the marketplace as a teacher in a public school system her whole life. And there's something absolutely remarkable about her. In 1999, she won the Woman of Distinction Award for the YWCA in Education in Edmonton, nominated by her teachers and her students. And if you read the nomination papers, the thing that would strike you immediately is that this person lived her faith. And that's what they described. Did they know it was Jesus in her or through her, or that she was joining Jesus there? Maybe not, but they saw him. More and more people have less and less Christian memory. And so that's what I want to talk about just real quickly. We had this great conversation. I wish I could say they all came to Christ that night. They didn't. But they saw faith. And that changed my whole understanding of ministry after that. If more and more people have less and less Christian memory, then, and given what Alan's been speaking about today, what are the core issues for us as the church that have to change? This is the challenge, I think, of the whole missional conversation. I think we still think it's just cosmetic. But really what we're talking about is something that is actually at the core of what it means to be the church in the 21st century. A book I would recommend, not my own, but a book I would recommend my book, but is a book by David Augsburger called The Dissident Disciple, where David says this. David says, we need to come to a place, and for evangelicals, this is a profoundly critical statement. We need to stop just saying that we believe in Jesus, but we need to begin to say that we believe in the things that Jesus believed in, and we need to do them, and we need to live them out. So, that story. Then I want to tell you one last story, and then we'll move on. I want you to come to my little church, which is just down the street. I attend this place because it's 5 blocks from our condo. I live in an area called Mimico. It's a church of about 100 people. Nobody will ever write a book about this church. The worship is terrible. Please don't quote me out of here. Our pastor is wonderful, but nobody's ever going to charge him with being the best preacher in the city. And 5 weeks ago, our pastor asked, how many of you, 100 people, 15 language groups, he said, how many of you, your first experience with church is Mimico Baptist Church? 100 people. And 60 people put up their hand. Now, it's a mirror of the Mimico community. High-end condos, regentrified houses, and low-cost housing apartments. And somehow, if you walked into this little church, nobody's going to call it a missional church, but it is. Because incarnationally, this church and our pastor, who is a servant par excellence, has dragged this church into the 21st century and into the community. When friends of mine moved back from France after 20 years in France, we have a school right next to us. And Heather, who was a teacher but hadn't taught in 19 years, needed to find a job. And our pastor went to the principal and said, there's a new teacher coming in. She hasn't taught for a while, but she's bilingual and she'd be perfect. the principal hired her on spec because Jim and this little church have lived into this community. But here's the tension. We have 5 Big B Baptists who never get it in our church. I've been the moderator for a couple of years, and we have all these people who don't know the choreography and don't know the language. Now, I'm telling you these stories because I think we spend so much time as evangelicals describing the issues when most of the issues are felt within congregations. They're experienced. So, I'm the moderator of this church. The 5 Big B Baptists keep saying, why aren't we doing more evangelism? We have a youth group of 25. Maybe a quarter of them have parents who come to this church, a church of 100. So one day, it was summer, a family that had been coming to the church for a long time, we didn't have Sunday school, and it was Communion Sunday, and sure enough, what happens is the communion starts coming across. First is the bread. And I'm sitting behind this little boy. His parents are sitting somewhere else, and I'm sitting behind this little boy, and I see his head going. Click, 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 right? We get a snack downstairs. That bread's really small. And he reaches out, and he grabs a handful of bread, and he stuffs it in his mouth. Right? And chews away, while the Big B Baptists go, they do kegels. The cup comes. Now, in our little church, we still use the little shot glasses, right? And you can see it come across, and again, I'm sitting behind him, and I can see the stuff going on in his head. He's just kind of going. He says, gee, we get juice downstairs. In his head, I can see him saying it. Then he realizes, gee, those are small cups. And then he looks forward on the pew, and he sees 4 little holes. Because this is a smart kid. And he goes, huh. And this is what he does. He takes 1, 2, 3, 4, passes it very nicely along, and then just goes. I received a letter on Monday to the moderator, which was me, from the 5. A 6-page letter talking about taking communion unworthily and all those kinds of issues, right? To which I replied with a 9-page Greek exegesis on the passages that they were quoting, pointing out to them the fact that that passage is to rich Christians who, frankly, are misusing communion, and that you might want to think about this. You know? One of the wonderful things, if you're a pastor, is to be a layperson again. It is so good. They phoned me, yelling. And I said, if you can't talk to me nicely, I'm not going to talk to you. Goodbye. And I hung up. And I realized all those years of pent-up stuff, right? All those years of just wanting to kind of, it was just to do that once. It was just like a release that I've never gotten over. Now, my point is that the things that we've been talking about in this context are things that are being experienced at a congregational level, at a whole different kind of level. I mean, what is it like to live in a country like Canada that is very different than any other place? I was speaking in Europe to a group of emerging young leaders in the church. I mean, and as they're talking about their context, they're talking about the change of their context, which is frankly about a church that's in the square in Europe. And the death of Christendom for them is very different than the death of Christendom in other places. I'm speaking in Australia, where you can still get some play in the newspaper with the church. I'm speaking in the UK, where the BBC still runs religious television. And then I come home, where after the Quiet Revolution, which was angry in Quebec, and a walk away from the church, the rest of the church just kind of drifted for about 40 years. Do you know that? I mean, the death of the, or the decline, I won't say the death, the decline of the church in Canada was a trickle, an apathetic walking away. Like, people aren't angry. They're just gone in Canada. You will find angry. Usually they're recovering fundamentalists and they teach religious studies. In my experience. I met with a group of religious studies professors at one point in University of Regina, and they would always I was their token evangelical, and they'd say to me, well, you believe this? I go, actually, no, I don't. You have to. I mean, you'll find those people, but in the Canadian context, it really was a moving away, a slow trickle. If you go into our cities and you look at the second circle of suburbs, you'll see united churches that were full in the 50s and the 60s. They have gymnasiums. They have all of the things that we would think of a church should have to be a real church. And now they're empty. I was 10 years in the city of Edmonton, and the United Church closed 9 churches. And every time they did play it on the religious page. And every time, this was the comment, which was interesting. People just don't come to church anymore. Sometimes it would be worse. They're not committed to church anymore. It was very interesting. There was one particular article I remember that the pastor was just angry. People haven't got the same kind of commitment anymore. Now, he was obviously not dealing with a full deck. But I mean, interesting. More and more people have less and less Christian memory. I get a phone call when I was pastoring in Edmonton. I'm coming to church on Sunday. Oh, I said, great. And who are you? And then she gives me her name. And it's the name in Edmonton. She was a lawyer, a labor lawyer, and she's the person that they bring in when they want it all to kind of be blown up. She's known for her strong sense of what's right. And I've never been to church, she said. I said, well, why are you coming here? And she says, well, my friend has started coming to your church. Interesting. My friend has started to come to your church. And she said this might be a good place for me. I need to soften up, she says. I said, I've heard of you. She says, I'm coming on Friday, and I want you to walk me through the worship service, because I don't want to be embarrassed. Which she does. She brings a yellow pen, and she marks where she has to. We were a liturgical church, so she marks where you had to stand up and sit down. She marks down what she would need to say, because we would say, this is the word of the Lord, and she said, okay, and what do I say? Thanks be to God. She wrote all that down, and I watched her during the whole service. She brought this bulletin with her, and she was following it to the T. And at the end, she goes to me, like, I survived. Now, in Canada, we've been talking about today, some of you will remember this from a book that Don Pasterski and I wrote in the 90s called Future Faith Churches. Maybe none of you will remember that. Because it was, thank you, Don. Well, I think it was paid for by World Vision, if I remember correctly. But in that book, we studied 14 churches. 14 churches that were seen to be engaging their community in new ways, Catholic to Vineyard. And in that book, we looked at these churches, we did study groups, we did all the kind of things Don likes to do in terms of sociology and all of those kinds of things. And then Don and I had a major fight in the hotel as we were writing because I thought this was really good. And Don thought another model that we had drawn up was good. And since I was writing the book with him, I lost. This is in the book, but I've kind of resurrected it because I want us to think in this kind of framework. What we've been talking about is the who. What does it mean for us to be the church in this day and age? What does it mean for us to be like Jesus in this world? I mean, all of those things. What we found out was that all of these churches that were engaging their communities in what we would now call missional ways, churches that were being missional, one of the things that we found out was they actually understood. This would not be a new conversation to these congregations. They would understand. They knew what the church was called to be and do. From people in the church to the leadership of the church, they could actually articulate this. The second thing we learned is that they were what we called, they knew when they were. And this is the other part. We tend to talk about this one more than anything as evangelicals. Pick up a book on missional anything, and they will spend at least 2 chapters on postmodernism. Right? I mean, it's this being culturally alert. And it's usually like this. It's usually written from far away. Like they're standing in some kind of observation tower, observing and looking at it, and then describing it, right? It's kind of like a high-level framework. They describe it. Matter of fact, in Borderland Churches, one of the things I say is we become very adept at this observational kind of framework. We build an observation tower, right? And then we go down and we shape the church. But actually what we first do is we just observe for a long time. Gee, things are changing. And then finally we think, well, gee, we should do something about this, seeker-sensitive churches. We go up to the observation tower, observe what's going on. We go down and then we build a kind of what I call borderland-friendly church. A church that's postmodern. In the same assumption that, of course, they're going to come. Now, the problem with that in Canada is they don't come. Frankly, there are a lot better things to do on a Sunday morning. I need to tell you that. Than to go to church on a Sunday morning. To 90% of Canadians. A friend of mine who became a new believer at First Baptist Church said, you know, you screwed up my life. And I said, well, how? And he said, well, Sunday mornings I'd get up, I'd get my newspaper, and he said I'd go to the high-level diner and have blueberry waffles and read my newspaper. Now, he says, I get to the T in the road, left is blueberry waffles, right is your sermon. And he said, I need to tell you, that's a big decision. He says, and 75% of the time, I choose to come to church. He said, but 25% of the time, what I used to do just sounds so much better than your sermon. Now, if that bothers you, you don't know what a big decision it was for him to come to Christ. To fit in, let alone come to Christ. So we build these observation towers. We hope that they'll come. We've got the band for it now. We're ready for all those people. You know, a secular friend of mine said one day, I got this advertisement, and he shows it to me, and it says, 10 reasons why people don't come to church. And he goes through the whole thing, and it says, because they've never been And then it mentions this church. And then it says, we have the hottest worship band in the city. And my friend, who's not stupid, says, what's a worship band? And I try to explain it to him. And he says, do they actually think that that will get me to come to church? And I said, I actually think they do. He says, do they think I'm that trivial and superficial? I said, actually, we do. And then he says this, if I ever go to church, now hear this, if I ever go to church, he says, I'm going to your church because I know you. All the studies show one thing. 87% of all people who come to Christ and come to church come because of, it's not rocket science, natural relationships. The third thing we do in this cultural place is that we look at we've kind of got the sanctuary all set up now, and we're ready for them to come. They don't come, so we finally develop what I call Borderland SWAT teams, or Borderland program teams. Like when Arnold was describing this gap, we were talking about this, well, what's this gap? Well, we've had to develop all sorts of programs to bridge this gap. Alpha is one of those. It's a great program. It's a great program. But we built these programs because we have not got touch with these people. So we have to build the bridges ourselves. So I call them Borderland SWAT teams or programs. That, we find the people who are most borderland friendly. Most kind of I define borderlands by the place where faith, other faith, and unfaith interacts. So, we find people who are comfortable in that place, and we develop the programs, and we bridge the gap. But that doesn't work as much as, or it does for a while. I have a friend, for instance, in the Alpha program. He says, I've been invited to dinner 5 times. I get it, but I'm not coming. Finally, we figure out that observing isn't enough. We actually have to live in the borderlands. We actually have to become people of the place. That it's the relationships. It's the people that we come in contact with. If you live in a condo, you know that there's a social culture to a condo. You don't talk to each other because you're not supposed to. That's why we're living in condos. There's no social interaction except at the adult daycare annual meeting. We call it the adult daycare because I've been to some of the worst meetings, worse than any church meeting that I've ever been is a condo meeting. So, in the midst of that, we have 8 condos where we live, and Carla and I decided that what we would do is we would break the social contract and invite them for a kind of cheese and other things kind of night. And wanting to be culturally sensitive to the place that we're in. And we do that. We send out, we slip under the door a whole bunch of invitations, and they all come. They all come. You see, you get in an elevator in a condo, and everybody stands there like this. And then all of a sudden, when the door opens for the first person to go off, everybody, it's like a liturgy. They all go, have a nice night, right? So 8 condos come together. We have this wonderful evening. At one point, someone says, what do you do? I said, well, I'm a Baptist minister, which starts all the conversation. But what was fascinating is, as they were leaving, this is what they said. I guess we're going to have to talk to each other in the elevator now. In Canada, Not only is there more and more people who have less and less Christian memory, Canadians have this profound sense of what I would call a social contract about privatization. And one of the things that we as Canadians, that nobody outside of Canada understands or appreciates, is we actually believe that religion is a private affair. Now, we don't think that spirituality, by the way, is a private affair. But we do think that religion, you don't talk about religion. My dad, who was a Mountie, a Sikh, the Sikh joins the RCMP and the turban is introduced to the Mounties. My dad just about has a cow. He's so mad. And I say, well, Dad, for them, it's a religious symbol. To which my dad, in great Canadian fashion, says, that's fine, but do it in your home. Canadian. So for us to have, if you want, the conversation, to break the conversation, we as Canadians are actually breaking the social contract. Profoundly breaking the social contract. And a part of the challenge for the church in the 21st century in Canada, I think, is figuring out how to make the spiritual conversation the conversation we have, because anybody can have that in Canada. 5 business guys asked me if I would come and meet with them and talk about spirituality in the business place. I didn't know what to say, but I wasn't going to miss an opportunity, right? They wanted to talk about spirituality. They said, we know you're a Christian and you can have one of those days where you can talk about that. We'd like to talk about spirituality first. Great. Great opportunity. In Canada, you can speak about spirituality. You can't speak about religion. So we've had this cultural conversation and this who conversation. I think the issue for us is the implementation question. Where? If you want your context. We know in Canada, and this is a third thing I would say about Canada, is we are profoundly contextual in our understanding and cultural understanding. Edmonton is not Calgary. I identify with the Rough Riders from Saskatchewan. Right? Thank you. Amen. Amen. What's that? Yeah. Oh, that's a dirty and bitter comment. It's context that actually shapes ministry. The values and the practices are transcendent, if you want. But how you take those practices and those values and the things we've been talking about and place them in context is a whole another issue. See, one of the reasons we went to Little Mimico Baptist Church, all the beautiful Christians, and there are many in that neighborhood, drive away from our church. They all go to better places. The reason we went there is because it looks like our community. It feels like our community. We see them on a regular basis all through the places. When we get invited to a party, we meet new people in the community. One of the things that I would suggest to you that we as Canadian Christians are discovering, and that I think we are further along in the journey, is that we no longer believe that there is a magic bullet program that's going to solve our issues. Canadians have played it out. And I often, when I'm speaking in the States, will say we're like a time-lapse camera 10 years ahead of you guys, and we've kind of given up thinking that there's a magic bullet that's going to solve this problem. What we have begun to realize is that if we are going to actually be the church in Canada, I believe we have finally begun to realize that we have to live into the community. That could mean if you're in Saskatchewan. Well, I don't know about Drumheller, John. I should watch my watch. What time do I? Oh, okay. I'm a Canadian. I'm sorry. Lost my train of thought. If I was in Drumheller, where's the community place? Okay. They're building it. Okay. In most little rural towns in Saskatchewan, it's a curling rink, a 2-sheet curling rink. Where do you hang out? I mean, I think we've come to the place where we've begun to understand that there's more to this. Just real quick, and then I will quit. Let me suggest that Canada is in a crossover, and I haven't got time. You can read the book. We live in what we call, and it's mentioned already, cultural pluralism. We're seemingly living without anchors. We really believed in Mosaic, but we are slowly discovering that Mosaic only works. We're finding out that we're racist because it's very hard in a government-legislated Mosaic to live without anchors. We are perceived by others to be relative. Partly because we are perceived as a postmodern world. I would suggest to you that part of being a pluralistic world, a pluralistic culture, means that we're not necessarily relative, but we know that our story isn't the only story anymore. And we've lived that out. We no longer understand. For instance, Remembrance Day was November 11th. How many of you thought of the rape of Nanjing? How many of you know about the rape of Nanjing? See, in Remembrance Day and pluralism, all of a sudden you find out that your story about Remembrance Day isn't the only story. Ask a Chinese person about the rape of Nanjing. When they think of Remembrance Day, when they think of World War II. Now, is that relative, or is that just humility, an understanding? The other part of this is that in relativism, if we believe in relativism, is part of it, we fear that we're losing the absolute truth. But in fact, in Canada, the issue is not whether we believe in absolute truth. It's how do we navigate our truth in the midst of all of the competing voices that are around us. And how do we invite our voice to the table so we can have the conversations in this place. So we're living in a spiritual search. We've been decentered. I think we as Christians are in search of our voice in the midst of this. We tend to only react when it's in our backyard. We tend to react to the issues that seem to touch us. And for a long time, we've been model-driven, searching for the answer. Anyway, I'll end.